R. Campbell Thompson's Semitic Magic, Its Origins and Development. Part C. The reason for the origin of the secondary superstition is not far to seek. The primitive conception of contagious taboo rose from the argument from the particular to the general. An indication among the Hebrews of liable for things belonging to them. Numbers 16:26. Depart, I pray you, from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing of theirs, lest ye be consumed in all their sins. This will be the more apparent if we take the obvious case of a man who has died in his bed of some infectious disease. If man, in his innocence, meddles with the corpses, or takes the infected bed to his kraal, the chances are seriously in favor of his contracting the same disease also within a short time. His fellow tribesmen can explain his death in two ways. Either it is the ghost of the dead man returning to plague the careless, who has now, by his act, established the connection which must always exist between the spirits and mortals before a ghost is in a position to demand its due rights, or the man has attracted the hostility of the evil spirit who overcame the dead man and will brook no interference with his prey. The soul of a dead man can bring sickness on a man who has sometimes connection with him during life. It is immaterial from the standpoint of the origin of the contagious taboo, which view we take, and probably primitive man would have some difficulty in making any certain distinction. Contagious taboo must have arisen in some such manner. Whatever the explanation may have been. Of course, this holds good only in the case of the man who has died of sickness, but it is from this very case that he probably argues that all dead bodies and their belongings are dangerous. He probably draws no rigid distinction between those that die naturally in their beds or are carried off by disease, and so the corpse of the one is as much taboo as that of the other. Hence, just as he assumes that all dead bodies are unclean through the potentialities of the souls for evil, so also will he consider any bed on which people have died capable of transmitting the dangerous taboo, because he has seen contagion arise in the special case of the disease-infected belongings. By analogy, in the case of the other unclean taboos, the belongings of such persons who are under these taboos are also unclean and dangerous. The foregoing short explanation has been offered as a standpoint around which the evidence brought forward in this chapter may center, and we may be able to see to what degree the Semites have evolved a systematic and workable theory concerning the taboos of uncleanliness. It is naturally the taboo of uncleanliness, distinct from the other, that of holiness, that we have to deal with in particular. The taboo of holiness is the outcome of the fear of transgression against the divinity, or what comes to the same thing, respect for Godhead. For polytheists, it's Godhead. This is over 100-year-old book, so, but I'm not sure about the page so much, right? Maybe printed in different page numbers or something like that. But the taboo of uncleanness has a very different origin. Although fear of the supernatural is at the basis of this also, it is easy to assume that a breach of some of the unclean laws is unappeasing to the tribal entity, particularly in the biblical legislation, but this theory does not account for the whole of, or even these, not to mention the far wider scope of the ordinary savage taboos of the present day. I should have. They talk about the savage philosopher in the 1800s as somebody with religious ideas that weren't developed in a single generation, perhaps not associated with inspiration or revelation at all, but long-standing conclusions. Reincarnation, for example, is one of these that they don't think happened in any one generation. As Robertson Smith points out, this assumption is a latter development to be found in the Levitical law. We have, then, to discuss the similarities of modern unclean taboos with the ancient Semitic laws, particularly as they are found in the Old Testament, the cuneiform tablets, and the writings of Arabic and Syriac authors. The taboos on holy things are comparatively well known, and it is the unclean taboos which are still somewhat obscure. The following are the quotations from what Robertson Smith in his Religion of the Semites says of the two forms of taboo, holiness and uncleanness. He goes into the question very thoroughly. He shows that holiness is essentially a restriction on the license of man and the free use of natural things, and that the ancient Semites, like other early races, deemed holiness to be propagated by physical contagion. And we see the penalty for the violation of the taboo was either religious or religious or civil. The religious penalty inflicted by the offended Attuas, or spirits, generally took the form of a disease. The offender swelled up and died. The notion that the Attua, or emissary, often an infant spirit, had entered into him and devoured his vitals. Encyclopedia Britannica Taboo. When men establish relations with the powers that haunt a spot, it is at once necessary that there should be rules of conduct towards them and their surroundings. These rules, moreover, have two aspects. One, on the other hand, the entity and its worshippers form a single community. Primarily, let us suppose that a community of kinship, and so all the social laws that regulate man's conduct towards a clansman are applicable to their relation to an entity. But on the other hand, the entity has natural relations to certain physical things, and these must be respected also. He has himself a natural life and natural habits in which he must not be molested. In all their dealings with natural things, men must be on their guard to respect this divine prerogative, and this they are able to do by knowing and observing the rules of holiness, which prescribe definitive restrictions and limitations in their dealings with the entity and all natural things that in any way pertain to the entity. Among them, he says, all taboos do not belong to religion proper, but appear in many cases to be precautions against contact with evil spirits and the like. And it is with these latter that we are concerned. Women after childbirth, men who have touched a dead body, and so forth, are temporarily taboo and separated from human society, just as the same persons are unclean in Semitic religion. In these cases, the person under taboo is not regarded as holy, for he is separated from the approach to the sanctuary as well as from contact with men, but his act or condition is somewhat associated with supernatural dangers, arising, according to the common explanation, from the presence of formidable spirits, which are shunned like an infectious disease. Now, a spiritual side of things, how can we, how can the modern scientists claim that they know that's not the case? And rules of holiness. The motive is respect for the entity. In rules of uncleanliness is primarily fear of an unknown or hostile power. Though ultimately, as we see in the Levitical legislation, the law of the clean and unclean may be brought within the sphere of divine ordinances on the view that uncleanliness is hateful to God and must be avoided by all that have to do with him. Since the publication of Robertson Smith's erudite and scientific work, the study of the cuneiform inscriptions has provided a new factor in the interpretation of Semitic religion. The translations of Assyrian texts had not, at the time that he wrote, reached a pitch of sufficient accuracy to be trustworthy. Nor was enough material at hand to enable him to avail himself of the most important branch of the science. But since then, hundreds of tablets bearing on the subject have been made available to scholars, and the value that they have in this study cannot be overestimated, as they represent a series of beliefs probably far more ancient than the epoch at which the tablets which we now possess were actually written. Further, the translations are now much more trustworthy, partially because of the large number of the new texts now published, which afford ample means of explaining doubtful phrases by parallel passages, and partially because Assyriology has made rapid strides in other branches in the last 2 decades. The whole of the Assyrian religion is therefore a comparatively fresh source to draw from, and it is in that arcana of exorcisms and magical invocations that we hope to find material to explain some of the difficult questions of the taboos of uncleanliness. Starting with this clue and taking beliefs as the handmaid of our investigation, we shall see that besides the taboos on the dead, the uncleanliness that rests with all sexual functions is most marked. Marriage, of women intercourses, or the man with an issue, the birth of a child, the risk that all babies appear liable until some time after birth, are all curiously tabooed, and, as Robertson Smith says, are nevertheless often involuntary and often innocent, are even necessary to society. Accordingly imposes a taboo on a woman in childbed or during her courses, and on the man who touches a corpse, not out of any regard for the entities, but simply because particularly the first menses, birth and everything connected with the propagation of the species on one hand, and the disease and death on the other, seemed to him to involve action of superhuman agencies of a dangerous kind. It now lies with us to follow this line of thought, see why this should be, and see how it affects the Semitic religion, not only in the more obvious precautions against the demons, but in the theories of atonement and of the firstborn. Now, let's remember that in comparison with the Bible, Islam, for example, does not consider these things associated with sex as being defilement. Now, there are people who commit sins, and that's considered defilement. But menses isn't considered dirty. The blood isn't considered dirty. The post-childbirth weight, women aren't considered dirty during that. The menses, now there's keep away from, and this has more to do with physical issues involved. But the Bible refers to covering your shame. Islam doesn't refer to humans is inherently shameful in their form, so nakedness is not referred to as shame. There's behavior that people would be ashamed of, but, it's not the nakedness itself. Besht, I think, is, one of those words that's used in Armia. Janub is not the same as Najas, if we're going to use Arabic words, was the point that I was making. It lies with us now to follow this line of thought and see why this should be and how it affects the Semitic religion, not only in the more obvious precautions against demons, but in the theories of atonement. The first one, okay, sorry, read that line. The taboo on dead bodies is the most obvious at first sight, a one that is frequently met with in Semitic literature. Among the Israelites, all that were unclean through the dead put outside the camp as to not defile it. See Numbers 5:1, 9:6. In old Israel, kings were buried near the temple, thus defiling it. Ezekiel 43, 7-9. And in the Islamic religion, ablution is necessary after approaching a dead body. In the apocryphal Tobit 2:9, after having buried a corpse, sleeps by a wall of the courtyard as one who is polluted. The dead Galoi priests of Syria were borne to the suburbs by their companions to be buried, and stones were there piled on them. Those that bore them were not allowed to enter the temple for 7 days after, lest the act should be nefas, or if any of them looked on a corpse, he was unclean for that day, and not allowed to enter the temple, but after that day he might be cleansed. Those who belonged to the family of the dead man were taboo for 30 days, and might only then enter with shaven head. The Nestorians were accustomed, in going out of the village with the corpse, to lay their bier in a clean place, and there perform 3 unin. And there's a Nestorian ritual for washing the dead. An important thing when entering old tombs and stuff like this, you don't shave for a few days. Some people working for the government have been told 5 days in terms of plagues and stuff like this. And shaving after, I don't, there's been these superstitions, like in my culture, it has this weird thing about hair. Hair is dirty. Shaving doesn't make you cleaner. I mean, there's bacteria on everything, so there's less surface, but you're more likely to catch infections if you shave anything. Here is the clean place, that is, in the atonement ritual of the Hebrews and Assyrians, not the euphemism for an unclean place, but a spot where there is least likelihood of the presence of demons, always unwelcome visitors at funerals. With the Arabs, a piece of iron or a sword is placed on the belly of a corpse to prevent its becoming swollen, which presumably means the iron, always powerful in magic, will prevent the return of the spirit. And let us remember, of course, that Islam does not allow grave goods to the point of even a different color of dirt. For the same reason, the orifices of the body whereby a ghost might force entrance are closed, the jaw being bound up, the eyes shut, and the nostrils and other openings stuffed with cotton. Doty tells the story of a man who refused to descend a well haunted by jinn before filling his ears with cotton, and when R. Josie went into unclaimed ground, a likely haunt of devils, with cotton wadding in his ears, all of his contemporaries objected. In the Talmud it is said that if a man who has just been bled goes out and meets a corpse, his face will become yellow, and if he meets a murderer, he will die, or if a pig, he will become scabby. Well, yeah, you are more likely to catch disease. Among the Assyrians, the danger of taboo from a corpse is amply vouched for by the cuneiform tablets. To look on a dead body demanded a purifying ceremony, and if a hostile wizard laid the waxen effigy of a man near a corpse, subsequent evil was sure to attack the victim. It is in Assyrian literature which shows the clearest of all that the spirit may return to attack those with whom it has had connection in life. The departed spirit is never very far distant from its earthly remains, and as we have seen, if a man contract a disease after touching a corpse, his illness is supposed to be due, perhaps, to the devil who has killed his friend, but more probably to the return of the ghost. The ghost becomes a malignant spirit who will resent any meddling with its body, or will inflict disease on its descendants or connections in order to obtain its due rights. Hence arises the taboo on corpses, and this explanation will be of service in further understanding of the taboos on the sexual functions. It seems clear that man is taboo from the fear of the ghost returning. Numbers 31:19 through 24. The ghost becomes a malignant spirit who will resent intermittently with the body, or will inflict disease on its descendants or its connections in order to obtain its due rights. Hence arises the taboo and corpses, and explanation will be of service and further understanding the taboos on the sexual functions. These sexual taboos were long ago clearly shown to exist among certain of the Semites by Robertson Smith, who brought forward evidence of the taboo on menstruation from the Quran, etc. For the Arabs, Bihrist, for the Syrian, was hardly necessary to quote Leviticus and Numbers. For the Hebrews, well, yeah, why not? 50:18, Numbers 15 and 22:4. And what's it? Oh, no, Leviticus 15 and 22:4, Numbers 5:1, and the Quran 2:222. It was said also that a black stone of the Kaaba became black from being white by the touch of a menstruous woman. People say a lot of things about a lot of things. That doesn't mean it has an Islamic source. For example, the Kaaba, was talked about long before the Quran. So, as Robertson Smith has shown, there were special taboos against sexual intercourse at certain definite times among the Arabs, Manaans, and Hebrews. Like, if you're to be sick or on a journey, or any one of you come from existing nature, have touched women, find no water, to take fine, clean sand and rub your faces and your hands therewith. Surah 5, I don't remember what verse they're translating here. The rules of sacred uncleanliness for these latter are very strict, and the Old Testament laws are full of them. Leviticus 15:18, and the taboo against approaching Sinai after such an act. Exodus 19:15, sexual intercourse is forbidden in a room wherein there is a Sefer Torah, roll of the law unless this be placed in a panel 10 spans higher than the bed, are enveloped in a cloth. Barakoth 3:4. For the Baal 3, man unclean by nocturnal pollution, Leviticus 15:16. And Barakoth 3:4. The Baal Kreh is directed to make only a mental recitation, without accompanying it with an anterior or posterior benediction. Compare to Iamblichus on the Mysteries, 2nd edition, 1895. Though the entities likewise do not hear him who invokes them, if he is impure from venereal connections, yet at the same time they do not refuse to lead any one to illegal venery. And why is it requisite that the inspector presides over the sacred rites ought not to touch a body? To add a few more examples to those quoted by Robertson Smith, we may maintain that Josephus says that everyone, even foreigners, were allowed to enter the first court of the temple except a menstruous woman. According to the Talmud, if a woman at the beginning of her period passes between two men, she thereby kills one of them. As she passes between them towards the end of her period, she causes them to quarrel violently. In Horioth, the following 10 objects interfere with one's studies: passing under the rope of a camel, and particularly under the camel itself, passing between two camels, between two women, the passing of a woman between two men, passing through the obnoxious odor of a carcass, passing under a bridge where nature has not been running for 40 days, and the eating of half-baked bread of meat taken out with the spoon of which skimming is done, drinking from a well streaming through a cemetery, looking on the face of a corpse. Almost every one of these is an obnoxious taboo. Rabbinic laws elsewhere demand that a woman, during all the days of her separation, shall be as if under a ban. A story is told of a woman whose husband died in the prime of life, and she made plaint to Elijah. Sorry about my squeaking, trying to find a position of wet clothes and whatnot. She made plaint to Elijah. What, the prophet, was his wont with thee in the first days of thy separation? Rabbi, he did not even touch me with his little finger. But in the last days, next Elijah, she answered, Rabbi, I used to eat and drink with him, and to sleep with him fully dressed on the bed, and his body touched mine, but with no intention of anything else. Then said Elijah, Blessed be the Omnipotent that killed him, because it is written in Leviticus 18:19, Shalt thou not approach. According to rabbinic tradition, menstruation and the pain of prima noctis were part of the curse of Eve. Yeah, we definitely see how conservatives make things worse. There is a story in the leaflet Kula of a woman saying, When I entered my bridal chamber, I was a niddah, and consequently my husband kept away from me. And there came unto me a wedding guest, and this son was born to me. Thus it was found that the boy was a bastard, and Ben Haniddah. It is to be noted that niddah, a woman in her courses, is from the root nadah, which in PL means to lay under a ban. Noon, Dalit, hey, and Palestine at the present day, women of their separation are not allowed in the presence of a woman in childbed, as very serious illness is believed to follow such visits. In Syria, a woman that has her courses may neither salt nor pickle, for the people would just think that whatever she might prepare thus would not keep. One of these three important duties among the Jewesses in Palestine is to attend to the special regulation for their sex regarding the ceremony of uncleanliness, the other two being to throw a lump of dough on the fire on the eve of the Sabbath, and to light the Sabbath candles, and neglect these means of suffering and childbirth. Maimonides says that the practice of the Sabians, even at the present general in the East, among the few still left of the Magi, was to keep a menstruous woman in a house by herself, to burn that upon which she treads, and to consider as unclean everyone that speaks with her, even if a wind passed over her, and a clean person. The latter was unclean in the eyes of the Sabians. According to what's said about Zoroaster, the menstruous flow, at least in its abnormal manifestations, is the work of Ahriman, or the devil. Zendavesta 1:92. In the Talmud, Yoma 8:1, it is the woman in childbed who is allowed to wear sandals on the Day of Atonement, lest she catch cold, by leaving them off, as other folks must. But the reason is probably from the danger to others who tread in her footsteps, as this passage from Maimonides clearly shows. On the other hand, it is a question whether this coincides with the admonitions about our Koth, that one carrying a dead body should go without shoes, for it may happen that a shoe be torn and be interrupted in its religious duty. The taboos on all circumstances connected with birth exist among the Arabs, Syrians, and Hebrews, and should therefore be no difficult thing to prove the same superstitions in Assyria. Indeed, the extraordinary thing would be if the law of the unclean taboo were not the same in all the Semitic tribes. Well, there's got to be difference is related to the differences of religion, the differences of material circumstances,